rather than dealing with the actual root cause of the problem, we're always trying to treat the symptoms after the effects. And I think all kind of restoration needs to be asking ourselves, how much can we restore a functioning ecosystem as opposed to managing all these problems into the future. As I was growing up, it was really late in my life that I kind of thought about what the landscape around me is doing for society. What is that landscape doing for us? Is it providing what we need? Is it looking after nature? Is it producing the food that we need? Is it looking after flood mitigation? Is it sequestering carbon? And it was never came up in my education, which I always thought was a bit strange. Someone interested in biology and ecology, and it wasn't probably I was getting into my 20s before I really started questioning it. And I work at the University of Sussex, and I was talking to my head of school, and when I mentioned it, when did you start thinking about the landscape, and is it doing what we need? She looked really confused. Clearly this is not something a lot of people, maybe outside land management, was really thinking about. And my son doesn't particularly like getting outside. He's pretty keen on the Nintendo Switch and Pokemon cards, but when he does, he seems to enjoy it. I just think it's just this nice way of thinking about the timescales. What can we do now to ensure the next generation is inheriting that opportunity that we've been lucky enough to have, and even our opportunity was probably less than some before in some ways and greater in others. And it's really important, I think, that we think about this. So I want to try and start this talk with a bit of time traveling. I want to go back and start thinking about how nature works before people started interacting with it. So did a bit of paleozoology back in the day, and looking at fossilized and subfossil beetles, which preserve really well in the landscape, but also have particular habitat associations. Some of them like dung on nice sunny slopes that open ground, others are really associated with trees. You can start making some reconstructions of the past. And this period in time, about 125,000 years ago, is a really interesting one. And that's because it was the last time we're in an interglacial period. It was temperate, it was warm, it was very similar climatically to today. In fact, slightly warmer than we have been, so an environment that we're heading into. But modern humans, Homo sapiens, have never set foot in Britain at this point. So if you want to look at a time that's quite similar in many environmental ways, that's not been influenced by people, this is a really fascinating time. And my eyes were really opened because, I was taught about dinosaurs, but I never was taught about the history of mammals, which is, somewhat strange when you think about it. And learning that, hippos were living in the Thames. We had the straight-tusked elephant, an elephant bigger than any of the elephants we have left today was. We had rhinos. We had this giant elk that had antlers as long as I am tall on each side of its head. Can you imagine walking through a landscape with 4-meter wingspan, get between two trees, you're like, oh, in real trouble. And one of the things that we learned about this landscape is how all the species that we're trying to conserve today in terms of the biodiversity were in this landscape. All the birds, all the butterflies, all the other mammals like wild boar and your small mammals. There's trees, the oak trees. This is ecologically not that long ago. You're well within the story of nature. And this system was working for pretty much all the wildlife. The rate of extinction happening in this system was incredibly low. Is this background level? A few species are lost just because it's their time, they get out-competed. So if you want to look at a system that hasn't been influenced at all by people and was working for the wildlife in there, this is a really interesting time. And one of the things I was really interested in is about the large animals and how they are creating part of this ecosystem. So this dynamics between succession, this kind of idea, this climax community that taller and taller vegetation until you get trees growing, that you have wall-to-wall forests, and you have squirrels running from Land's End to John O'Groats, is somewhat challenged by these large animals and how they influence ecosystem. The browsers, the grazers, as they consume that vegetation, they're creating this mixed, diverse, heterogeneous landscape that was great for biodiversity. So it's a fantastic model to really think about, and I think something we need to teach our kids a bit more about, because it certainly wasn't when I was growing up. We jump forward to about 40,000 years ago, we're in the last glacial. This is the last ice age, I suppose. Not a lot like the ice age movies that you may have seen, but we've got a cooler climate. We're in the south of England, so we're not covered in glaciers. It's quite warm in summer. It's not too different to what we're talking about today. And while we've lost things like the straight-tusked elephant, that's hanging out down in Spain at this point, we've still got large animals like the woolly rhino, the woolly mammoth, these animals that are well adapted to a cooler environment. But the reason I show this is about 40,000 years ago is the Homo sapiens are arriving in the landscape. Now, we've had Neanderthals here for a lot longer, but it does seem that wherever humans turned up as we marched out of Africa and colonized the world, the megafauna went extinct. This was kind of the start of the big human impacts on the way nature works. So woolly rhinos, cave hyenas, lions, all these large animals that had been pretty much ubiquitous for tens of millions of years across most of the world started going extinct. This is the first big change. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether it's humans, was it climate change, was there some interaction between the two? My research suggests it's the humans, so I'm probably biased towards that. Others maybe say it's a bit more climate change. But this is a big moment of change. It's a big moment of change in the way ecosystems work. We can really see that when we come forward again to about 7,000 years ago, when we're back into an interglacial warm period. The climate is very similar to it was in the last interglacial. But now we didn't get those straight-tusked elephants. There's no narrow-nosed rhinoceros. There's no lions, no giant deer. These have all gone extinct by this point. Mammoths were hanging on in Wrangel Island to about 4,000 years ago. But their impact on a continental scale had changed fundamentally. What was fascinating from a beetle perspective is there's far more beetles associated with woodland for this point than there was in the last interglacial, suggesting that while we had aurochs running around, they weren't having as big an impact on the vegetation as you were getting in the last interglacial. So you've gone from that kind of African savanna type thinking, type ecosystem to one that's still a mixed mosaic, not had traumatic extinction. You've lost a few dung beetles strongly associated with really big dung, but you've just got a different makeup of the ecosystem. This is a really good reminder that nature's highly variable and dynamic. When people talk about a baseline and how nature works, that isn't a fixed set of rules. There's not like a certain group of species doing exactly the same thing, the same numbers all the time. You've got this very complex system. Ecology is actually much harder than physics and mathematics and all the rest of it, because you've got this kind of chaotic system in here. There's a nice bit of randomness that's very hard to predict and very hard to understand. But you've got a system where you've got some big predators like wolves and lynx left, and you've got humans now acting as living as hunter-gatherers in the society. And you've got far fewer dung beetles and more woodland beetles. So you've got this change in the ecosystem. If we jump forward again to about 2,500 years ago, agriculture is now well established in the landscape. We've got these new stationary set up communities that are farming the landscape. Now, what's really interesting for me here, what was a real eye-opener, was the structure of the vegetation of this landscape is more similar to the last interglacial than it was to the early Holocene. You've arguably got humans in a low-intensity agricultural system, very few humans present, having a similar impact on the ecosystem as those megafauna were at the time before. And it's probably we weren't having a mass extinction at this point. We still got high biodiversity in this area. Many of the species, you're still getting those open areas, the wooded areas, those mixed mosaic vegetation structures. So you've got a different system again that's still meeting the needs of all those organisms living in. If we jump forward again to the present, now we've got big change. We've got industrialized agriculture homogenizing the landscape. 75% of the UK under some form of farming. Nature pushed to small pockets, smaller numbers of individuals, smaller population sizes mean more threat to extinction. We've now got a landscape that's really trying to support the needs and desires of the human, of one species, largely at the expense of a lot of others. and it's creating a less resilient ecosystem. The more you put one species at the center of a community, the more susceptible that community is to extinction and loss. So you've got a real problem here, and this landscape has been created for lots of reasons. Some of them good, some of them not so good. There's no individuals here, I'd say, you can put blame for this. This is the collective, consequences of social, cultural decisions and values have created this landscape. But now we've got to look to the future and say, what landscape do we want in the future? What does society and the culture need? If we've got to think about what's it going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time, what do we want it to do? How do we want it to work? Now, there are lots of different options that we can be exploring. And that's good. Diversity, I think, is good. And there is an interest now in nature restoration. There is an interest in putting nature back together again. And just before the pandemic, there was this real excitement about politicians announcing how many trees they are going to plant. 1 million trees, people getting very excited. And the next politician working at a bigger scale, it's 1 billion trees, And then you can just waiting for the 1 trillion trees, we're going to get really excited here. We're going to plant it in the ground, and everyone's getting super excited. All these targets, everyone thinks it's great. I was in the car just finishing a workshop on kind of what the landscape's going to look like, and there was just so happened to catch the Radio 4 news program about all these trees being planted. It really got a lot of attention. It was even 5 minutes of airtime, prime time, talking about how many trees everyone's going to plant. I was just waiting for it. When's someone going to ask, can't trees plant and grow themselves? When's it going to happen? Surely someone's going to chip in here and say, trees have been around for a lot longer than people have. When are they going to be planting themselves? And it never came. I went home and I was talking to my stepdad. I was like, Tony, I can't believe it. Like all this talk of common sense. Always people talking about common sense. I'm always a bit nervous when people start talking about common sense. But I just heard a radio program and no one talked about trees planting themselves. He's like, it's not going to happen. You've got to plant them. I was like, no, Tony, seriously, ecology here, seed dispersal, this stuff happens, even in our denuded landscape, it can happen. He's like, no, I've heard nobody talking about that. So it wasn't just this radio program, all the newspapers he's reading, all this source of information that we are bombarded with these today. Very few people at that time were talking about the fact that nature is a living system that does things like plant trees. There are times where we might have to plant them. I used to work in the Scottish Highlands. There's not a lot of trees left up there. There's not a lot of viable seed soils. There may be times where we need to plant them, but let's just question it at least some of the time. And I live down the road from Knepp, and that's a great example of trees planting themselves, but only in one of the blocks, only under certain circumstances. It doesn't always happen. It's dynamic and variable. But I think this problem we have is we're always thinking about human solutions, human management-driven solutions to any problem that we have. We put ourselves at the center of everything. I work in conservation. I've been to sites where we're planting some trees over here, and over here we're cutting a load of trees down because they're growing. Why? Why are you planting over here and chopping down over here? Well, that's in that management section, and that hasn't got enough trees. This one has in this management section and has too many. Well, does that really matter on the big scheme of things? There's this human-centered approach, partly because of targets and partly because policy comes in and makes life quite difficult. But all of these ideas, I used to work on the Scottish Highlands where we're culling the deer up there. There's good reasons for doing that, but better to introduce the predator, do it 24/7. And beavers, obviously, the classic example. Do we want to go and create leaky dams, or do we want beavers to do it? And I think what we're really dealing with is we're always asking, how do we fix rather than dealing with the actual root cause of the problem, we're always trying to treat the symptoms after the effects. And I think all kind of restoration needs to be asking ourselves, how much can we restore a functioning ecosystem as opposed to managing all these problems into the future? So one of the slides I like to show is this one, thinking about how ecosystems work, very much humans part of that ecosystem. but they're made up of processes. Processes are interactions between organisms and their environment, and all of those interactions build this complex system which creates this ecosystem as a whole. But all of these processes can be driven in different ways, and there's generally human ways of doing it, and there are nature's way of doing it. In fact, lots of the management we do is because we've lost the natural side of it. So up in Scottish Highlands, very effective predator, the human gamekeepers I was working with, or rangers I was working with, very effective on the rifle, at least partly because we didn't have any wolves or lynx up there. You know, leaky dams replacing beavers. We've got coppicing instead of rather than elephants. We've got lawnmowers and people without clearing scrub rather than our oryx. And then we get down to this side of things, and we still have some elements of nature working at this point. So we still got some tree planting going on by jays and other species out there planting trees. But there are places where things like pollination is starting to break down, and you're getting people out there with paintbrushes pollinating all the plants. Now, if we get to a point where our conservation NGOs are calling up volunteers to be handing them all paintbrushes and go, right, I want you to go and connect and pollinate all those plants. Maybe, I do wonder if we get to that point where we're going to wake up and really question, do we have to hit restoration rather than management? And I think that applies actually across the whole system. So that's true from like a restoration and ecology point of view. And my interest in rewilding is really about reintroduce a permanent solution. Let's get a system that's working rather than a human management response all the time. Now, I'm working that from a very rewilding point of view. Nature conservation is your only goal. That's a very single-minded view. Nature conservation isn't all of it. I'm not talking about rewilding the entire world. It's not going to work out for people very well. There's lots of different goals and objectives out there. And what we really need to be thinking is a much more joined up view of nature restoration, and saying that a lot of our decisions to this point has been working land very, very hard when you've done this industrial agriculture in particular, where you've kind of extracted a lot out of it to get that food for the reasons people have been doing it, has degraded that ecosystem as a whole. Now, what we need for the future is a more resilient ecosystem that's providing a greater variety of services and benefits. It can't just be food at the expense of soil, at the expense of flooding. We've got to do more out of our landscapes. Now, while I'm particularly interested in rewilding, I actually think there's lots of ways of doing restoration ecology. We've had regenerative agriculture, or agroecological, or biodynamic farming. You've got traditional conservation, you've got targeted habitat restoration, you've got sustainable forestry, you've got nature-based solutions. These are just general philosophies that people tend to get behind and start supporting. And the problem with the conservation group is we like fighting each other. If you're a rewilder, you're a threat to the traditional conservationist or the traditional restoration zone. So if you go on social media and follow any kind of groups of conservationists, you will find people spending an awful lot of time, emotional energy, attacking each other brutally about telling you how rewilding is an irresponsible way. It's not going to work in the future. It's not a solution overall. Whereas the rewilders, you can't always do traditional conservation. We can't manage it all the time. My personal view is if you're trying to deliver diversity, taking a diverse set of approaches for land management, creating lots of diversity in those approaches is going to be good for providing for those diverse needs of people and nature overall. So while, I may have probably contributed to some of those arguments coming from a particular perspective, I think there's lots of different views here. And this is just from a restoration point of view. This doesn't even go into all the other side of things that we need to be thinking about. There's fantastic regenerative agriculture out there that I thoroughly support. We probably need some industrial agriculture out there to maintain food supplies and certain things. We need to challenge all of these systems, but we don't want to reject particular ideas and solutions on ideological grounds when our needs are so diverse. I'm not going to say rewilding is going to be the solution to every problem for nature and society part of nature and people out there. It's just part of that idea. And I happen to really appreciate rewilding. So if I get in charge of a piece of land, that's the option I'm probably going to take. But I can thoroughly appreciate, some fantastic regenerative farms I've been to see, wonderful traditional conservation that is, helping species persevere. You've got targeted habitat restoration for specific things. There's so many positive things out there that we need to be getting behind and really supporting. The other side of this is it's a great opportunity to say that we're all unique individuals. We've all got our own values, ideas, and passions. That's a great opportunity for us all to run in a slightly different direction and start create that diversity of things that we need. So, I think there's a real opportunity in that and a real something quite exciting about it if we can start supporting each other rather than telling each other we're wrong all the time. So I just want to go into some research just to try and back that up. It was a bit of interdisciplinary research. We've got some social science and some ecology. Okay. And what we were looking at is various different land management. So in Sussex, so we have Ashdown Forest Conservation Area, we have Knepp as a rewilding site, we have Saddlescombe, which is a farm on the outskirts of Brighton, Tablehurst, which is kind of agroecological farm, Butcherlands, which is much more conservation and more prescriptive management, and a nature reserve on the council area. So we want to do two things. We wanted to find out what people thought land management needed to deliver, what they thought was going to be the best ways of achieving that. And then we also wanted to get on the ground and measure a bunch of stuff from an ecological, biodiversity, social point of view. This is Knepp. Are people familiar with Knepp? Anyone? Yeah, not. So this is quite a famous rewilding project now. 20 years ago, it was a traditional farm. So 2001, we worked with satellite data, which was pretty cool, to look at what the vegetation was like at the start of the project. The nice thing about satellite data is it goes back in time. And we could see that Knepp is divided up into 3 different blocks, and the landscape was quite similar, maybe a bit more woodland up here, a bit less down there. But one of the interesting things about Knepp is the different management that was undertaken in these different areas. So in the northern block up here, when they took it out of production, they were able to fence it straight away, and they introduced cattle into that area pretty much straight away. In contrast, in the southern block down here, which is slightly larger, they didn't have funding to put the fencing up. So there was a gap of about 6 years before any large mammals went in. And that difference, which was totally down by chance, resulted in really different ecosystem outcomes. So here you've got this scrubby landscape that's really established. It's much more mixed than this. This is kind of low resolution because it's satellite data. Whereas in the northern block, you've got something quite different, just to highlight how nature has very different paths for it in things like if you happen to take a slightly different approach. So if you go to the southern block, which is the famous part, it all looks like this, whereas the northern block is much more grassland, which is just starting to scrub up. Now, this difference, again, is not a right and wrong way to do anything. This one, southern block's a bit more celebrated than the northern block is, but that's heading to a more wooded landscape, and this kind of scrubland dynamic landscape is great for a bunch of species. Now, this northern block might be a bit further behind that, but it might just pick up all the species that are liking this early scrub succession habitat, might move over here. And so just again, just that dynamic landscape is really important. So yeah, so we talked to a bunch of people about landscape, what they want out of the landscape, what do they think we need the landscape to deliver, and asking people to define their own goals rather than us telling them what we think they should be wanting. And what we found was there's lots of different ways, lots of different things people want. 67 different criteria that came out. And one thing is they really want for landscape is nature to benefit society. We need food, we need water, we need energy, we need all of these things just to support us and benefit us. We also need nature as culture. So we need opportunities for education, places to visit, that spiritual connection with the land. We need all of that as well. And then we also just need nature for nature's sake too. So there's a lot of things we want in there. And if you start looking at what every species needs and all the different habitat setups, we've got a lot of diversity. So how do you deal with that? That's quite challenging. So what we tried to do was measure a bunch of it, and we kind of split it up as to kind of biodiversity goals, provisioning, so how do we look after society in terms of food production, water and energy, what's known as supporting and regulating ecosystem services, So things like soil, carbon, and things like that, water quality, these cultural ecosystem services, and then a few others that didn't fit so well around the viability of the business and the ethics, how well you're looking after the animals. And we tried to measure a whole bunch of things, but because we're ecologists, we're massively biased. So we measured loads of biodiversity metrics. It was a short-term project. We only managed to measure one provisioning service, some of the supporting and some of the cultural things. So there's a lot to measure, a lot to try and understand what landscape is happening. Then we asked, do they think, all our expert practitioners that contributed to our research, that were interviewed by us, do they think an agroecological farm is the best way of delivering against what they think is most important? Is a conventional farm the best? Is a peri-urban nature reserve or a rewilding estate the best way of delivering each of the things they're really looking for? And what these scores basically do is say, what do they think the best case scenario is? So if you do agroecological farming really well, how will it perform against each of those criteria? If it does it really badly, how bad might it be? So what it does is it expands out the kind of range of possibilities. And what this figure basically says is, whether you're a farmer or a conservationist, there's a lot of confidence that agroecological farming is going to be quite good, really popular. It's a way of bringing together farmers and conservationists, which is often quite challenging. Conventional farm, not perceived quite so well, but good on a few things. Nature reserves kind of in the middle, and rewilding kind of goes the full extent. Really good for some things, not so good for others. This is the expert perspective on this. When we collected lots of data on it and presented it in a similar way based on a variety of different sites, what we actually found is all of these different things are the best at something. They all tend to be the worst at something. And actually, they sit quite in the middle. And what this basically means is there's no one solution, based on this quite small piece of research, there's no one solution that can deliver everything for you. What you need is that diversity of approach to deliver all the different things. And it's quite interesting that, and we can break this down into different categories. So we can look at kind of supporting ecosystem services. So things that are really going to benefit people. This agroecological farm did really well here. So maybe there's a bit of bias around the perspective of our experts thinking, we really need to look after ourselves, and that's really important. From a biodiversity point of view, we had two nature reserve, or the nature reserve and the rewilding site doing pretty well. But also agroecological farm was very good, as the agroecological farm was doing very well. And actually, interestingly, this nature reserve, which happened to be Ashdown, didn't do that well across most of our biodiversity metrics. It just happened to look after a bunch of rare species really well. So we're giving quite a lot of land to preserve relatively few species, just to let them hang on, which is quite interesting in itself. So from a cultural ecosystem service point of view, it really just depends how close you are to people. You can be the wildlife trust doing some great nature conservation, but if you're a long way and people can't get there, people aren't using it. So you get really dynamic, interactions happening. And I think it just goes back to this idea that we really need that diversity of journeys. And you can really just get on and take your own approach. And if you really embrace these kind of messages and say that we need to make these positive changes into the future, go on your own journey, meet lots of people that are doing interesting things, learn from it, and then take that information, apply it to the landscape and the culture that you're part of, you're going to make that positive contribution. Now, for me, this was the piece of land I had available to me. We relatively recently had to we bought a new house. We had to move to make commutable both my wife's jobs and my own. It was a new build, unfortunately, in many ways. And the garden we got looked like this, which in September 2020, which was highly depressing. I don't know what it is. It's something about creating prison yard type feel. Everything was just felt 2D. There was no kind of interaction with it. It might be good for kicking a football around. What we did was we did some really intensive rooting around the edge, and we did some human-led planting of larger shrubs to try and make things happen a bit faster. So that was the human side of it. We put in some fruit trees, and then we pretty much let it go wild, probably much to the dissatisfaction of our neighbours. And nature, within 1 year, going from September there to July 2021, It had bounced back in all its glory, in its own form of glory, with various different species. And you don't need to be an ecologist to look at this landscape and go, is this more diverse than that? I think, any votes for this one versus that one? You don't need all the data to see it. You can just look at the photos. And if you spend 5 minutes in there, you're watching all the side of it. Now, my 2-year-old in particular loves this garden. He calls it the jungle. Most of the vegetation is above here. You can play hide and seek just by lying on your belly around here. We mow this area around here to give him a little running track to run around, which he appreciates. But he's climbing through all the vegetation. He's really getting a part of it. And it's quite a contrast to some of our neighbors who have gone down the artificial grass route, which I must admit, just, it's hard for me to support, even though they're clearly just slightly different priorities to me. But I think we need to celebrate, what some people might describe as a messy garden as something that's an adventurous garden, an exciting garden, a spontaneous. Lots of positive words could be associated with this form of garden. And it's about a change of culture as much as anything. And ragwort started turning up. And if you already want to focus on a species that makes an interesting cultural response, ragwort is a great example. It's a fantastic species for our pollinators. You just don't want to cut it and put it in your hay and give it to your horse. And it's getting that balance between, I don't want to see horses die from eating ragwort, but I don't want to see us, nationally remove a plant that's fantastic for pollinators. And we need to have that discussion and engage in many different ways. And I think even if we can take small steps on whatever scale you're a part of, I think you can make a positive difference. And it's not just good for me, because very quickly we had a new colonizer coming into our garden, who we've made the hole slightly bigger for our little hedgehog population. And you can see them making a small difference, even brought some megafauna from my garden back into it. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. I probably haven't got time for questions, or I may have overrun. Grand. But thank you very much.